Let's just start things off by saying that the Race Sim Studio Formula Hybrid 2021 is fantastic. And the problem that I've alluded to in the video title really isn't anything to do with the car, or indeed the work that RSS have put in to make what is probably the finest single-seater car available for Assetto Corsa. As you would expect, Race Sim Studio have once again produced a real winner. They've been working on the Formula Hybrid project for a long time now, and that has produced some wonderful cars that have helped define the standard upon which other Assetto Corsa mods are measured. But that in and of itself poses a bit of a problem. Hello fellow sim racers, another year and another Formula Hybrid video that lags behind the rest of YouTube by a couple of weeks. Oh well. Let's kick things off by talking about what it is that makes the Formula Hybrid 2021 different from last year's car. Among the various rule changes that have been implemented for this season, many of which really don't apply to the sim racing side of things, are a number of aerodynamic changes tasked with slowing the cars down. Imagine that. The main visual difference on the cars can be seen on the floor, which now must taper inwards from what is roughly the midpoint of the car, or 1800mm back from the front axle if you're the sort of person that's interested in passing scrutineering. Also gone are the fancy slots and cutouts that were added to the edges of the floor. These were intended to generate vortexes that would effectively seal off the edge of the car's floor, making it more efficient. And finally, we have new restrictions on the size of the rear brake duct winglets and diffuser fences, which you'd be forgiven for not noticing if I'm honest. So what does that all mean? Well, a bit less downforce is the pithy but accurate answer. A 10% reduction was the goal though, with the gains teams usually make over the winter period. Who knows what that number actually looks like. Though, based on Bahrain, we can confidently say that most of the cars were between 1 and 2 seconds slower in qualifying trim than they were back in December. And based on my testing of this car, that feels about right for the replica in Assetto Corsa. Though obviously this does vary from circuit to circuit quite significantly. The Race Sim Studio version of the 2021 car does have one other change from the previous version. The partnership with Precision Sim Engineering does seem to have come to an end, and now the in-game wheel is provided by Rexing. And guess what? You can purchase your own version in real life too, if you have pockets that are exactly as deep as mine aren't. And while we're on the subject of visuals, I really don't need to tell you that this is, once again, a work of art. The detail is superb, as we've come to expect from RSS, and it's really hard to imagine a better route to a high-quality 2021 top-flight Formula car. Once you're inside the car, things are also exactly as you would expect, and if you drove the 2020 car, then you'll know roughly what you're getting yourself into, which is to say, a really refined single-seater driving experience that's very much become the benchmark against which other similar cars are measured. One thing that did jump out though is that this car seems just a little bit easier to get up to speed with than the previous versions. Now, I don't mean that it's necessarily easier to drive, but it does seem to be more intuitive, or to use another semi-meaningless term, they seem to have improved the drivability of the car in its default state. Tricky setups have, in my experience at least, always been a bit of an aspect of Race Sim Studios cars, and in the past you could perhaps criticise them for being maybe a little bit too sensitive right out of the box, though I'm certainly in no position of authority to do so. But for the Formula Hybrid 2021, things just seem a little bit better on the default setup, it feels more forgiving, and you can lean on it just a little bit quicker than you could in previous years. Or maybe I've learned to drive in the past 12 months. Doubtful. Comparing it to last year's car is all well and good if you've driven that, but if you're not familiar with the Race Sim Studio Formula Hybrid cars, then what can you expect with this mod in the driving department? Well, first of all, you have a car that effectively toes the line between being an on-the-rails aero monster and something that's actually quite slippery and tricky to drive. At low speeds, the immense amount of power and torque from the current hybrid power units makes it quite tricky to get the power down, but once you get up to high speeds and the aero switches on, it clings like a cat on a pair of curtains. So, all in all, that means it's a reassuringly difficult driving experience, as any top-flight single-seater should be, but it also behaves consistently and predictably, which isn't always the case with mod cars. When I say it's reassuringly difficult, I mean that it isn't the most beginner-friendly car, but equally, it's not as tricky as some of its more animalistic ancestors, particularly from the previous turbo era. And since people always ask, the force feedback's detailed and communicative, though, as is common in Assetto Corsa, it does load up quite heavily once the downforce levels ramp up at higher speeds. The 2021 car seemingly does have a little less downforce, which is more keenly felt in the high-speed corners. The previous car was a little bit of a surgical scalpel in these areas, highly precise, but it could still draw blood if handled incorrectly. But even with this year's downforce reduction, it hasn't really significantly dulled that sharp edge. And if you're going into this expecting it to be more blunt force trauma than precision instrument, then, well, you're going to be disappointed. I mean, let's be honest, 1 to 2 seconds slower is a lot in the world of Formula 1, but outside of that bubble, it's actually quite a small change. In fact, one look at the 2021 cars at Bahrain a couple of weeks ago will give you a pretty good impression of what to expect. And that's the best test I can apply to any sim racing car. Does it feel plausible given my incredibly limited frame of reference? Yes it does. So, I did mention that there's a problem. The RSS Formula cars, I guess they're a bit like an iPhone. They're market leaders with an incredibly refined product that seemingly gets minor revisions year on year. And the issue for me is that it's actually quite hard to find interesting things to say about this car every year without sounding like a broken record. Moreover, there seems to be less buzz about this car this year in the community, or perhaps I've just not seen it. But to me, that feels like a genuine problem, because the reality is that this is definitely the finest Formula car that's ever been produced for Assetto Corsa, and, well, maybe even for sim racing in general, but its release perhaps isn't being heralded with the level of fanfare that it deserves. Of course, the Apple analogy only stretches so far, and it falls apart when we hit the price. At less than the cost of a motorsport magazine, a cup of coffee from a tax-dodging dystopic chain, or 8 Class B engineering bricks, it is very well priced, which means I've no issue with buying a new version every year, and it's my guess that most of you feel the same way as well. As an aside, it was very kind of RSS to put a few content creators' logos, including yours truly, on the side of the car's default liveries as a way of saying thank you to the content creator community. Now, I'm sorry I didn't show off more of them during the video, but honestly, I really wanted an excuse to show off this lovely Alpine livery. Speaking of which, the 2021 community skin pack that I've used throughout the video is available on Race Department as you'd expect, and I've put a link in the video description. And thank you to all of the people who contributed to that really very well-made livery pack.